everybody, Dan Bailey here, and this is episode 5 of my Fujifilm retrospective, where I'm looking back at my 10-year journey shooting with the Fujifilm X Series cameras. And if you're just tuning in, you can find a link to the first episode in the description below, and so you can follow the whole series up until now. A couple things before we get started. Just want to say thanks again to everybody who's tuned in and watched these episodes so far, and also everybody who's left a comment. It's been really fun to read about how you transitioned to the Fujifilm system. Again, it's just super fun to have this Fujifilm Love Fest and just hear everybody's stories. So keep the comments coming. And also I want to let you guys know about my Photography on the Brain series. This is my exclusive video course where I dive down and explore some of the aspects of creativity and image making on a much more cerebral level than I usually do on the YouTube channel. And so with this series of 30 lessons, my goal is to help you guys become more creative, more confident, and more introspective photographers as you're working to establish and develop your own style as artists. You can either do the course monthly, or you can download the whole bundle of all 30 lessons at once so you can watch them at your convenience. Either way, you can find my Photography on the Brain course at this link right here. Okay, let's get started with episode 5. This is going to be a really fun one. There's a lot to cover here. We left off the last episode at the end of 2015. We had just gotten back from a 5-week bikepacking trip of Romania, riding around Transylvania, shooting with the X-T1 and the X-T10. Well, that fall, I had my second book published. This was a small pocket guide. It was published by Backpacker Magazine and Falcon Guides. It was kind of an abbreviated version of my first book, which had been published by Focal Press a few months earlier. Also that fall, I started doing some speaking events. Fujifilm had me talk at the booth one of the days at Photo Plus in the fall of 2015. And then a week later, I spoke at the Kenmore Camera Expo for the first time. I did 4 talks over 2 days, and this was a lot of fun because I got to meet a lot of photographers, and I know that some of the people who are watching probably saw me during that first Kenmore event. So that's how 2015 ended. By the beginning of 2016, I was shooting full-time with the X-T1 and the X-T10 and shooting all kinds of stuff. It was winter in Alaska, so I was shooting snow-covered landscapes, mountain aerials. You've seen some of my mountain aerial photography in these videos. This is one of my favorite styles of photography that I've been pursuing in the last decade. I have a 1947 Cessna 120, a little yellow 2-seater tail dragger. The winter time is my favorite time of the year to shoot aerial mountain photos here in Alaska because the light is just so amazingly gorgeous. It's magical pink and orange light on the snow-covered mountains of the Chugach Range, which is just east of Anchorage. So on a clear afternoon, I'll take off about an hour before sunset and I'll fly up, climb up over the mountains, and then I'll open the window and I'll just shoot photos as I'm flying by these big mountains. And it's a really magical experience to be up there. I actually made a video called Aerial Adventure, which you can find at this link. Just shows you what the experience is like when I'm up there shooting mountain aerials out of the plane. Also by the spring of 2016, I'd acquired a couple new Fuji lenses. The little 35mm f2, which is one of my favorite lenses of all the X Series glass. It's just a super fun little prime, weather-sealed prime. I actually love the whole series. I have the 16-2.8, the 35, the 50, and the 90. And I just love all those lenses. But the 35 somehow resonated really strongly with me, and so it's been one of my most used lenses for the past few years. On the complete other end of the spectrum, from that tiny compact 35, I also got the 100-400. It's one of Fuji's red badge zoom lenses, and it's an amazing piece of glass. This is an absolutely stunning, pro-quality lens on every level. I've shot everything from action to portraits, even some aerials with it. It's really a fantastic lens. There's one thing that I forgot to mention in my last video. I talked about the massive firmware update that the X-T1 got a year after it came out. They gave it the new autofocus system and all these new features. And there's one feature I forgot to mention, and that was the fact that they added the classic chrome film simulation to the X-T1. And that's appeared on every model since then. Although they don't specifically mention this, Fujifilm patterned classic chrome after Kodachrome, which was the preferred slide film for so many photographers for decades. And compared to one of Fuji's really colorful profiles like Velvia, for example, classic chrome has a much more muted, subtle look to it. And so it's an ideal film profile for shooting things like photojournalism and even portraits and anything where you want to give it that kind of more subdued, abbreviated look to your imagery. Special thanks to Danny G, who was one of the YouTube viewers who commented and reminded me of this. So thanks, Danny. In the beginning of 2016, I got another camera as well, and that was the little X70. In the first couple of videos, I told you how much I loved the X10 and the X20. The X70 was a similar size and form factor, but it actually had the full APS-C size X-Trans sensor. And so image quality out of this was, again, exactly the same as the X-T1, the X-T10, all those other models. And it was a great companion on a trip we did to Oregon in March of 2016, where we just went down there, rented a car and drove around and did some fast hiking and trail running in some different areas. And so I just kept this thing with me. Half the time I just held it in my hand while we were running, and then it was right there. And this was a cool camera because a lot of point and shoots and a lot of pocket-sized cameras at the time, like the Sony RX100 series, used a 1-inch sensor. And the X70 had the APS-C size X-Trans sensor, which was way bigger than that 1-inch. And so the image quality from this was stunning. It also had a working aperture ring. It had a tilt screen, metal dials on the top deck. Just a fun little camera. In addition, it had very fast autofocus and 8 frames a second shooting rate in continuous mode. So this thing was totally action ready. This was an interesting time for me. I had just hit my 20-year mark as a full-time pro photographer, and having started my career in 1996, I'd weathered 2 major recessions along the way. The 9/11 crash and also the 2008 recession. And by this time the photography industry had changed drastically. Not only was digital photography taking a firm foothold, the proliferation of web advertising completely changed the way that money was spent in the advertising realm. A lot of magazines went out of business during this era, and assignments started to drop off as well with the recession. And a lot of photographers were scrambling to figure out how to adapt their businesses to stay afloat during this new era. And one of the ways I dealt with this change in the industry was I started blogging. I started my blog in 2007, and a few years in, I started to shift it towards a more educational focus, trying to teach and inspire other photographers. And with all the Fuji-related blog posts and reviews going up on my site at the time, I started to see an increase in traffic and also in comments and questions from people asking about the Fuji system. So in April of 2016, I wrote and published a free guide called Fujifilm Tips and Tricks, which I put on my blog, and it's still there. You can download it for free. By the beginning of 2016, the X Series was 5 years old, and Fujifilm had released a number of models, and they had a growing line of lenses for all these cameras. At the end of January, they announced the XPro 2. This was a long-awaited announcement because the XPro 1 was 5 years old at that time. That was the first interchangeable X Series camera. The new XPro 2 took the world by storm. People were absolutely blown away by the photos that came out of the XPro 2, and people started to jump ship in droves. A lot of people who'd been sitting on the sidelines for the past 5 years waiting for Fujifilm to come out with a real camera, a real high-quality, serious machine. It was kind of funny. I just remember seeing so many people in the past 5 years talking about how Fujifilm wasn't really serious and their cameras were not as good image quality as like the Sonys and stuff. And then the XPro 2 comes out and they were like, oh yeah, Fujifilm, awesome, which was great for the company, and it was duly earned because the XPro 2 was awesome. It's like with a lot of people, it was finally cool to shoot Fujifilm. And this was such wonderful news to all those XPro 1 users who've been patiently waiting for a new model. 5 years! And every time Fuji came out with a new model, like the X-T1 or the X-E1, anything, people were like, nope, waiting for the XPro 2. When's it going to come? I don't know, but I'm waiting for it. And I always thought this was kind of funny, but when I think about it, I had the same fanatical devotion to the X-T1. I feel like it was designed especially for me, and it just felt so perfect in my hands. So I can understand that type of devotion. And of course, Fujifilm gets all the credit for designing and building cameras that have such longevity and inspire such passion and fanatical devotion to these models. So the XPro 2 announcement was a really big deal for me, not because I was an XPro shooter, but because I could see what was coming. I knew what was going to hit the next XT model whenever that came. And for me, it came in May, when Fujifilm sent me the brand new camera to test. It was super secret, and it even had a special code name that I can't tell you. Of course, it wasn't a secret to the rumor sites who were publishing all kinds of speculations about what the next XT model was going to be. Well, I had it in my hands, and I shot with it for 2 solid months. Having shot with the X-T1 since it showed up on my doorstep in February of 2014, it had been hard for me to imagine how any other camera could ever capture my heart in the same way, and how I could ever switch to a new model. And yet all that changed the instant I pulled the X-T2 out of the box and turned it on. Building on everything that went into the X-T1, the Fujifilm X-T2 brought the X Series to a whole new level. It had been refined and optimized in every single way. The body was pretty much the same size and layout as the X-T1, just a little bit bigger, a little bit taller dials, but it had so many upgrades inside and out that made the X-T2 an absolute powerhouse. On the outside of the camera, there were 2 big changes. On the back, you had the brand new AF selector and joystick that first appeared on the XPro 2. This just made it so much easier to manipulate your focus controls when you're shooting in a quick situation. In addition, the dials had been made a little bit taller, and where the X-T1 dials were locked by default and you had to press the button to turn them, 2's dials were free by default and you could press to lock. And that was a really welcome change. That just made shooting so much easier, especially if you were wearing gloves. In addition, it had the same kind of tilting screen that the X-T1 had, but it also had a vertical screen tilt as well. And this was cool because it gave you more options when you were trying to shoot in difficult and challenging situations. With these cameras, I'm often shooting overhead or down below or kind of off to the side. And so having the screen be able to tilt 3 different ways just makes for a much more ergonomic shooting experience. And with the X-T2, Fujifilm introduced a brand new, totally revamped, upgraded autofocus system. Where the X-T1 had a 77-point autofocus system with 15 phase detect pixels, the X-T2's autofocus had 325 autofocus points. 169 of those were the fast phase detect pixels, and they covered over 40% of the frame. This was twice as many autofocus points that even the Nikon D5 had at the time. And that was Nikon's flagship camera. So with the X-T2, Fujifilm meant business, and they delivered in a huge way. The X-T2 also had a brand new 3rd generation 24 megapixel X-Trans sensor and a whole new image processor that was 4 times more powerful than the one on the X-T1. So the new sensor and processor on the X-T2 allowed better color accuracy, higher resolution, better noise reduction, and a higher native ISO of 12,800. And the X-T2 had 15 film simulations, including the brand new Acros mode, which was first introduced in the XPro 2. Modeled after Fujifilm's Neopan Acros black and white film, Acros produces beautiful gradations, wonderful silky smooth tones, high contrast, and a very complex grain structure that looks even more awesome when you crank up the ISO dial. I love shooting Acros at ISO 3200. I think it looks like magic. It looks like old film. I have no trouble shooting Acros at 12,800. In fact, a lot of times I'll just jump from 3200 to 12,800. I'll just skip 6400 entirely. I just love the way this looks. To me, it's very similar to the hexagonal, very gritty grain structure that Kodak T-Max 3200 film had. I actually found a picture shot on T-Max 3200 black and white film that I compared with the X-T2 at 12,800, and they were strikingly similar. In addition, the high-powered X-Processor Pro chip in the X-T2 meant faster autofocus, reduced shutter lag, reduced blackout time between frames, higher EVF resolution and refresh rates, and the ability to shoot in 4K. And Fujifilm introduced a brand new vertical battery group for the X-T2, which included a boost mode, and this increased performance even further. And this meant that the X-T2 was an absolute powerhouse machine for shooting things like sports and fast action. And it also gave a little bit better balance when you're using the larger lenses like the 50-140 and the 100-400. But you could always remove the battery grip, slap on a small prime, and you were back to relatively the same size and form factor as the X-T1. So I was in heaven. For everything the X-T1 had, the X-T2 just brought it all to a way higher level of performance in every way. So that summer I threw everything at the X-T2. I shot fast bike racing, I shot wildlife, I shot landscapes, I took it hiking and bikepacking. The X-T2 simply became my full-time brand new companion. I shot a lot of cycling in the summer of 2016. Every Wednesday night in Anchorage during the summer they had crit racing. And so I would go and race the B race and then shoot the A race and then hang out with my friends and drink beer later after the races. Just a really fun time, but it was an excellent opportunity to test the capabilities of the X-T2. And that's when I discovered one of the really cool features of the camera, the Autofocus custom settings menu. You could actually change and adjust the specific parameters of how it behaved when it was tracking and acquiring subject matter in the frame. And given that these kinds of settings were only found in high-end DSLRs at the time, this only proved Fujifilm's absolute and total commitment to provide professional-grade cameras that were comparable in every way to modern DSLRs. Later that fall, I shot another season of cyclocross here in Alaska. We had some really great locations and awesome races. There's one incredibly muddy race we had. I shot the whole series with my X-T2, and it really got me thinking, 3 years prior, I was shooting with cyclocross with the X20 and the XE1, and those cameras were not action ready, and I was having to adapt my shooting style in order to compensate for the limitations of the camera so I could get the kind of pictures I was wanting to shoot. Well, 3 years later, the X Series had finally arrived. The X-T2 was an important camera for Fujifilm. It was the X Series evolved, and it was the model that proved without a doubt that Fujifilm was capable of producing cameras that could compete with any camera out there in terms of performance and quality. In the last video, I mentioned that I had been a part owner in a photo workshop company for a while. And so that summer, I did a number of our sunset photo workshops where we'd go look for moose in the early part of the evening. And then we'd move towards this wetlands area called Potter Marsh, where we could photograph landscapes under the setting sun and also photograph birds. There's a lot of Arctic terns and seagulls out there. And the Arctic terns, they're fast little birds. They dart around. And so they're incredibly challenging to photograph. And so during this time, I was able to test, how good is the X-T2 for shooting this very fast, unpredictable, erratic action? Passed the test in flying colors. The autofocus system was totally capable, and it was able to keep up, especially with the longer lenses, with the 50-140 and the 100-400. I even shot a bird pooping in mid-flight at 11 frames a second. After I did my X-T2 review on my blog, this guy emailed me and asked me about whether it was good enough for BIF. And so I responded to him and I showed him all these pictures I'd taken and I explained how well it works. And he wrote back and said, well, we'll just agree that the X-T2 is not BIF ready. I was like, what? What are you talking about? Of course it's ready. I also led a number of bear viewing tours that year where we'd fly across the Cook Inlet to one of these areas like Katmai National Park. And I also did a few aerial glacier tours as well, where we'd fly over the glacier in helicopters and shoot aerials, and then we'd land and shoot close-ups right on the ice. And in July of 2016, I led my Midnight Sun Glacier Overnight Workshop, where we all flew out to this area and camped at the edge of a glacier lake. And then we spent the hours under the midnight sun photographing icebergs and the glacier and the scenery around this area. And then we all helicoptered back the next day. Earlier, I told you I had started to do more speaking events. Well, in March of 2016, one of the Fujifilm reps invited me to speak and do the keynote presentation at a dealer conference in Chicago. So I went out there and told them about my experiences with the Fujifilm cameras, showed them my favorite pictures shot with the X Series, talked about the film simulations, and talking about the image quality in the cameras. And almost every picture in the show is a straight JPEG right out of the camera, as all of these are that you're seeing. And again, that's one of the most awesome aspects of the X Series, is we can just put these cameras in JPEG mode, choose the film look that we want with the film simulations, and get these incredibly beautiful photos without needing to spend all this time processing. And it went off really well. In fact, all these dealers came up to me after the show and they said, hey, that was great, come speak at our store. So that kind of opened the floodgates for me to do even more presentations at camera stores and events around the country. And so in that year, I spoke at Sammy's PhotoCon in LA. In August, I spoke at Bedford's Camera in Little Rock, Arkansas, where I shared the keynote speaking duties with Scott Kelby. He was headliner on Friday night, I was Saturday night. In October, I had the honor of being one of the instructors at the Great Smoky Mountains Photography Summit down in Tennessee. And this was a great experience for me because I got to teach alongside some of these very notable landscape shooters in the industry. People like Matt Kozlowski, Leonard LaRue Jr., Jack Graham, Bill Fortney, Deb Sandage. And then later that fall, I did a little SoCal tour where I spoke at Sammy's in LA and then drove down to San Diego to speak at Nelson's Camera. And then a few weeks later, it was back to Kenmore for the second year in a row. And I really enjoy these speaking engagements. In fact, that's one of the most rewarding aspects of this whole Fujifilm life that's unfolded for me, is getting to meet you guys and geek out on cameras in person with other Fuji shooters. So with all the workshops and presentations I was giving, I had the blog, I had the free little ebook on my site. And so I was getting a lot of people asking me questions about the Fuji system. So I was starting to spend a lot of time answering emails, which I was glad to do. In fact, I answer every single comment here as well in the videos because I like sharing my knowledge, but I also like to geek out on cameras. It's just what I like to do. And eventually all of this led up to what turned out to be one of the biggest things that's ever happened to me in my photography career, which we'll talk about next episode, so you'll have to wait to find out what that is. In the meantime, please subscribe to my channel. You can ring the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Again, please leave comments. Even if you've commented before, keep them coming. If you're an X-T2 shooter, tell me your X-T2 stories. It's such an amazing camera. Talk about some of those things you've shot with it. Some of the mind-blowing ways this camera changed your life. If you are a Fuji shooter, you'll want to check out my best-selling ebook, X Series Unlimited. It's a 400-page manual that'll show you everything you need to know in order to get the best performance and have the most fun with your Fuji. So until next episode, thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate the support. Take care, have fun with your Fujis, and I'll see you next time.